Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Deep and narrow, Ape Canyon is cut into the southeast shoulder of Mount St. Helens. It got its name from the Battle of Ape Canyon, which was said to have happened there in July 1920, when a real fight between man and beast took place. The writings of the Native American tribes from the Northwest states, such as the Colum and Cowlitz, talk about a strange and secretive race. This mostly undocumented tribe was called the Sciatic by its neighbors. Its members had strange and supernatural powers, and they looked so strange and foreign that the other native groups would go out of their way to avoid getting in touch with them. People said that static warriors were between 7 and 8 feet tall and had an unnaturally thick layer of hair that made them look like they had animal hides. It was said that these evil beings could put charms and spells on both humans and animals to make them hypnotized. Some stories said that the Sciatic could kill by just putting the thought of death in the mind of their victim. Most of what was said about the secretive race agreed that they were mostly nocturnal and lived in mountain caves and fishes during the day, only going out to hunt and forage at night. They would sneak into the camps and villages of the people who lived in the area, and take whatever dried meat and fish they could get their hands on, and in some cases, kidnap any unfortunate women. In addition to being able to talk to each other telepathically, these monsters could also imitate any animal in the forest with their voices. They had a superhuman sense of smell, which made them great trackers, and they could blend in with their natural surroundings, which made them tough opponents. Over time, many of the tribes who lived in Washington and Oregon came to believe that the shy Sciatics were finally extinct because they never saw or heard from them anymore. But sometimes, the hunting party would come across big footprints that crossed their territory. With the start of the 20th century, the native tribes had to deal with much more real dangers. The story about the Sciatic went away in the end. But as settlers kept moving deeper and deeper into the traditional hunting grounds of the native tribes of North America, they sometimes found that the legends of the people they were encroaching on had a worrying tendency to push them back. The town of Calcho in Washington state, but always had a bad reputation as a hub for the many communities of miners and loggers who worked in the area. Because there were so many brothels and other places with liquor licenses, the small town in the middle of nowhere got the unflattering name Little Chicago. In the early hours of July 12, 1924, a group of dirty gold prospectors stumbled into one of Kelso's many taverns. They told 2 other customers how they had just barely escaped a race of people they called mountain devils. As the morning went on, the small group of people who had gathered to listen to the group's story slowly grew until it got the attention of 2 state park workers, J.H. Hoffman and Bill Welch. The 2 park rangers listened with interest as the 5 dirty and messy newcomers took a break between drinks to tell their amazing and scary story. They noticed that the leader of the band, Marion Smith, and his son, Roy, were the quietest of the rest of the group. Fever and John Peterson were a little more talkative, but it was Fred Beck who did most of the talking. Beck talked for a long time about how the group had spent the last 2 weeks, working out of a cabin, looking for possible gold seams in the nearby foothills. Occasionally, he stopped to ask his colleagues for clarification or help. They had just been sick not far from the Lewis River. The men were very productive at first, but then all of a sudden they felt like they were being watched by something they couldn't see. As the treasure hunters went about their work, they started to see signs that they were not alone. Some of the tracks were up to 14 inches long and had 4 short toes. They were found in the mud near the cabin. The men also caught glimpses of a large animal moving through the forest. They thought it was about 7 feet tall and walked in a strangely bipedal and humanoid way. On Friday, November 11th, the prospectors had a late lunch and then went up into the hills to look for gold until it got dark. They hadn't gone very far at all. But before that, their trip took a completely unexpected and confusing turn. As they moved along the base of the mountain, they came face to face with a group of strange creatures that had just come out of hiding in a ravine that was in their way. There were 4 of the creatures, and Fred Beck said they looked like huge gorillas. They were covered from head to toe in thick, matted black fur, and Fred Beck thought they must have weighed around 400 pounds each. Time seemed to stand still as the two groups looked at each other, and neither side moved a muscle until one of the giants took a heavy step forward and let out a guttural, inhuman roar. Beck said that his friends had fallen over backwards out of fear, and that the monster's savage cries had echoed and reverberated off the rocks around them. He instinctively raised his rifle and fired shot after shot at the attacker. When he finally got his 4th hit, it knocked the animal off its feet and sent it sliding down the side of the ravine it had come out of. At this, the last 3 creatures also started to roar and scream, and the 5 prospectors ran away. They didn't stop until some distance later, when the strange howling and bellowing finally stopped, but the tired adventurers barely had time to catch their breath before they were running for their lives again as many shadowy figures slowly came out of the caves and fishes they had already passed. As soon as the last piece of wood was put in place, the men rushed to reinforce the cabin's door and windows and arm themselves with whatever tools they could find. A series of strong outside impacts all at once shook and rattled the whole building. The heavy blows that kept coming from outside were accompanied by the howls of the animals they had run from, which now seemed to come from everywhere in the building. It wasn't long before the first makeshift barrier broke under the constant attack. One of the creatures tried to get inside through a hole it had made out of desperation. Roy Smith tried to stop it with an axe, but was violently knocked to the side. In the end, Roy's dad used a pistol to scare it away, and the hole was successfully closed. The group's attackers then seemed to change their strategy, and the men could do nothing but watch as a large hole was smashed in the ceiling above them. Before, big rocks and boulders kept getting thrown into the cabin. When one of these things hit Fred, it hit the back of his head, knocking him out for 2 hours. When he woke up, the attack was still going on. His friends were crouching quietly next to him and shooting up through the hole in the roof whenever they saw movement. At first light, the constant roaring and hammering from outside the building finally stopped. After what they thought was a long enough break, the miners looked outside to make sure none of the mountain devils were waiting for them. Then, they grabbed their belongings and ran as fast as they could in the direction of Kelso, where they told their story. Hoffman and Welch didn't have to do much more than offer Beck a few drinks to get him to lead them back up the mountain to where he said the incident had happened. After spending several hours climbing over the ravine in question, the 2 rangers found no sign of the monsters Beck had talked about, except for a few spent shell casings, but when Beck showed them what was left of the cabin, it was a very different story. The small shack's roof was completely smashed in, the furniture inside was broken, and there were big rocks and boulders all over the room. Before rushing back down the mountain the way they came, the 2 men stopped to take measurements and impressions of the strange footprints that surrounded the structure of the wreck. Behind them, the sun was slowly starting to go down. Local and national news outlets picked up the story quickly. They called it the Battle of 8 Canyon, and people came from all over the world to see if they could see one of the elusive mountain devils for themselves. There would be no more sightings of the creatures Fred Beck and his colleagues talked about, but the tale would stay in people's minds for many years. In the 1950s, an article in the Seattle Times said it had finally found out the truth about the mysterious event. When former members of the YMCA troop at nearby Camp Meehan said that they and the rest of their friends were the ones who attacked the prospector's cabin. They said that they had thrown rocks onto the cabin roof from high up on the neighboring hillside and that the drunk gold miners had mistaken their echoed whoops and catcalls for the roaring of an angry Sasquatch. Despite this, Fred Beck never stopped believing that his attackers had been something other than human. Even when some of his opponents were able to copy the tracks he had shown the park rangers by just moving their fingers and palms. He refused to believe that he and the other people who were looking for money had been duped by a complicated scheme. Beck's ideas started to be very different from those of the other people in his group as time went on. Mary Ann and Roy Smith said the creatures that attacked them were wild animals whose cave must have been close to their cabin. Beck, on the other hand, thought they were actually highly intelligent beings from another dimension. He went on to write articles and pamphlets that linked sightings of Sasquatch in the United States to sightings of Yetis in the Far East. He said that this was proof that beings from a parallel universe were trying to take over the world. Even though people have seen Bigfoot all over North America in the past, the Pacific Northwest seems to be a hot spot for the phenomenon, with more than a third of these supposed encounters happening there. Most descriptions of these huge cryptids are very similar, but people have different ideas about where they came from. Nearly every native tribe in the area tells stories about cannibalistic wild men who chose to live away from the rest of humanity, high up in the peaks of the mountains. The natives believe that over time, these people changed into the animal-like creatures their ancestors sometimes saw, which now look more scary than human. Some scientists think that the fact that some Sasquatch footprints have claw marks means that these creatures are more likely to be living hominins that were thought to be extinct. There are similarities between the fossil samples found in the deserts of Africa, and it is thought that the species may have crossed the land bridge as Pangaea separated and lived on in more remote parts of the North American continent. Strangely, the supposed Battle of Ape Canyon is not the only mystery in the area. In August 1963, 4 climbers coming down the same side of Mount St. Helens stopped to rest at a rock formation called Dog's Head. One of them, Jim Carter, agreed to stay behind and take a picture of the rest of the group as they moved away again. After a while, the other 3 people in the group started to worry that Carter hadn't caught up with them yet. When they finally made it back up to where they had left their missing friend, there were clear signs in the snow that a fight had happened, along with the box of camera film that had been left behind. The skiers then followed what seemed to be Carter's trail, which went in a completely different direction from the way they had come down the mountain. It seemed to be a random and unplanned path. The tracks showed that Carter had been moving quickly and making jumps and turns, which were very dangerous. After a while, his ski tracks stopped near a steep drop, so the group went down to Kelso to ask for help from the authorities. Even though the canyon floor was searched for 2 weeks around the tracks of the missing skiers, which were similar to those of the monster that Fred Beck shot there 40 years earlier, no remains were ever found. Since then, no one has been able to find or name the species that attacked Fred Beck and his friends in the 1920s and chased Jim Carter to his death almost 50 years later. As we've already seen in other shows, science and technology haven't been able to solve all of the mysteries and strange things that keep happening in the United States because its geography is so big and varied. It's not clear if the huge, hulking creatures mentioned in these reports are the cursed ancestors of America's first people or some elusive offshoot of people's journey through evolution.